Resin casting with fillers. In this tutorial, we're going to be covering the use of fillers to add weight to a resin cast. Now, in previous tutorials, we've discussed the use of obviously pigments and colors to change the appearance of a resin, but in this tutorial, we're going to use fillers to increase the weight of a resin cast. Now, many of you are familiar with just standard basic resin casting, taking some of our resins like this is the TC808 Jet Black that just gives you a black resin. And this is great for standard casting, but there's times when you might be doing a particular ornamental cast or something, especially desktop art pieces and things that people will be picking up and moving around. And one of you had called the other day and we were discussing this use of fillers to add weight and about the perception people have with art pieces when they pick up a piece that has some heft to it. People associate that with value and expense. So if they pick up something that they perceive to be made out of plastic and it feels light, they associate that with cheap, even though, as you well know from this arena, that pure, straight resin casts are the most expensive. But for the general public, when they pick up something that's just a resin cast piece, they typically, if it feels light, it feels cheap. So in this video, we're going to be adding fillers, just very basic fillers. In this, we're adding play sand to a resin cast to give it some weight. And we're going to discuss some of the ins and outs of how to do that. Overall, it's a very simple process, but I just want to point out some of the important considerations with this process. But overall, to add something like play sand is a great way to, again, increase the weight of a piece without affecting too much of the other physical properties. Now, obviously, with any filler like this, when we start to add a lot of filler material, two things happen. One, obviously, we're lowering the amount of resin that's actually in the part. So depending on the resin used, that could start to weaken it substantially. So obviously, the more filler that we have in proportion to the resin piece, the weaker the part becomes. Then second of all, the viscosity goes up. If we're working with a really low viscosity resin, that's advantageous to using something that's already starting out really thick. Because if we're starting with a fairly low viscosity resin, then we're adding fillers to it, then we still retain a relatively low viscosity. But be aware of that. When you start adding fillers in, you're going to change that viscosity and bring it up much higher, making it thicker, and thus trapping potentially more air bubbles. And that, of course, is where you have to look into pressure casting options. If you're doing statuary and really intricate pieces, really it's going to make sense, especially if you have a lot of little fine details, to do those under pressure to eliminate those air entrapment on the surface. So let's get started. Okay, now for this particular cast, we're going to be using the ArtKast pourable resin system. This is our house brand resin, and even though it's a house brand resin, that doesn't mean cheap or ineffective. It's just a lower cost resin system that a lot of you have discovered recently and prefer this for a lot of your casting. Now, one of the nice things about this system, and the reason we're going to be using this for this application, is this has a little better moisture resistance than some of the comparable resin systems. So real important, anytime you're working with a dry filler like play sand, that you want to be aware of the moisture sensitivity of the resin you're working with. Now, one of the things you can do to help offset that, because any dry filler will be a magnet for ambient moisture. So one of the things I like to do right prior to pulling this bucket out for this video, I keep this under a hot light. And what that does is by keeping this under an incandescent hot light, or even using a heat lamp from a restaurant supply, that helps keep any ambient moisture from collecting in that dry filler material. So that's a really important step to be aware of. If you're working with a more sensitive resin system, that's definitely something you want to be aware of. Now for this cast, we're going to be starting with we're going to do 100 grams of A and 100 grams of B. This is a 1-to-1 mix ratio by weight. And again, when in doubt, when I say testing, always a good idea to do a small test with any new technique that you're using, just to see how it works in your mold and just in your particular shop setup, and make sure everything is going to work the way you expect it to. Sometimes you can have those little happy accidents that work out even better, but just most importantly, you just want to be prepared for any surprises before you do a more expensive cast. Okay, so we have A and B, and we're going to go ahead and mix that up. We don't have to stir it too much right now, just a quick mix. Remember that the ArtKast, the standard ArtKast formula, is a 3-minute working time at room temperature. So you want to be aware of that. You want to get your filler into this, mixed up, and poured into the mold as soon as possible so you don't waste valuable working time. Now we have right here, this is about 8 ounces of liquid resin, and we're going to add quite a bit of filler to this. And we're about doubling, we're adding the filler at about a 1-to-1 mix ratio. So this is way more than probably most of you are going to do, but I just want to do kind of an extreme example so you can see how this works and see how that radically changes that mixed viscosity. At this point, it's almost like we're working with wet pour concrete. And even though you're dealing with a filler, make sure you mix well. Don't be shy about scraping the sides and the bottom of the mixing container. And one of the nice things about that, the short working time, is that keeps our filler suspended. Now, one of the things you'll see that I've got handy is a brush, so I can push that into the detail, because since this is such a thick mixture, I'm going to have to kind of push it into that mold a little bit. And some of that, it is more dense than regular casting resin, so some of it will settle into the mold, but it will trap air if you're not careful. So one of the things you have to be careful about is the moisture in the filler material. If it reacts with the resin, what will happen is the resin will start to expand like a foam material. So, and that's basically how urethane foam is made. So what happens is if that the ambient moisture in the filler reacts with the resin, you get this slight expansion. And it'll be like a really dense foam, but it'll have sand in it, which of course, in this case, what's going to happen, having sand inside your resin makes it almost impossible to clean up and trim later on. So real important to make sure you're dealing with moisture-free fillers when you're working with urethane resin, because again, you will break your tools trying to trim this down. So you don't want that to expand out. Don't think it's going to be like foam where you could easily trim it back, because again, this will be like trying to cut through a rock when it's cured. Now, because this has such a high volume of filler in it, it's going to be a little more difficult to see that color change when it kicks off, but you'll still see it a little bit as it transitions over and cures solid. But one of the reasons I chose fairly simple shapes for this is because I am using such a high percentage of filler that it's going to be harder to get really fine detail like we would get on, something like this piece right here. So again, this has a 3-minute working time at room temperature. And remember, that working time starts as soon as those two components go together. And then a demold time on this of typically around, this typically has a demold time of around 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the cross section of the part. And those of you new to this world of casting, remember that mass casting resins like this are the opposite of air drying materials. So the thinner the cross section, the slower the cure. So completely opposite of an air drying material. So we're going to give that some time, then we're going to break these out and see what we have. Okay, these pieces are ready to demold, and I'm not expecting a lot because this is probably the maximum amount of filler you would ever do. Again, this was roughly 1-to-1 by volume. So this is typically more what I would do to backfill a larger hollow cast. Because yeah, we do have some air bubbles here, but overall we have a nice chunky resin part. And again, these areas right here, right now while this is fairly green, we could trim those off fairly easily, but remember that if you wait too long, this is like trying to trim a rock. So, and overall, other than the bubble entrapment, just from how thick it was, our filler does not affect the surface property. So we can see some of the filler through the resin, but it's not really changing the feel of, it's not changing the texture of the part. Now this one came out a little smoother. We got a little bit of air entrapment. And in some cases that might actually help the look of a piece depending on what you're casting. But there you have filler added at a ratio of 1-to-1 with our resin. So now we're going to back off that a little bit and do some resin casts with that with a little bit less filler. Okay, so again we're going to mix up another batch of resin, this time again with 100 grams of A and 100 grams of B, and still using the ArtKast pourable. Now I have not tried this with the ArtKast pourable slow, and that's our 6-minute version of this resin formula. And I don't foresee any major problems other than just remember when you use this with a slower resin system, two things are going to happen. One, it's going to be more susceptible to moisture contamination because of that longer open time. But also, it's going to give your filler more time to settle out. So something to be aware of there. There might be times when you're using a filler and you want it to cure while it's suspended in the part. And if it has too long of an open time while the resin's kicking, you've got time for the filler to settle out to the bottom of the mold. Okay, so once again, we're going to get our resin mixture stirred up. And it doesn't take long to do that, only about 10 or 15 seconds of mixing to get our A and B components together. And this time around, we're going to add just one of these cups. Last time we did 2 of these, so we put in a lot of filler last time. Now the other thing you can do for adding weight to an art piece is also using steel shot. If you're doing that technique, you want to make absolute sure that you do a surface coat of another resin first, because otherwise you're going to wind up with all that steel shot pushing up against the surface of the mold. Now this is a much more detailed piece, so I'm going to pour that in and then brush that into the detail. And just remember, when you do this technique with a brush, this brush is done after this. And you see that flows a lot better now. We're using about half as much filler as we did on that last pour. So not near as much need to go in there with a brush and check our work, but use some of that runoff right there. Again, the more we can keep that tidy in the casting, in the mold, eliminates a lot of cleanup, because again, that's really tricky and difficult to clean up these filled resins, especially when you're using something like sand. Now another filler material you can use if you don't like this look, this kind of aggregate look that you see through the surface, another material that I've used is just dry plaster. I've actually just used just standard #1 pottery plaster that's dried out in an oven, and that works fantastic. Just dry plaster, obviously without the water, and take that and put it in a baking pan and dry that out, and that makes a fantastic filler. And that's also good for faux marble kinds of effects. So, okay, we're going to let these kick and demold it and compare those to our pieces with the high percentage of filler. Okay, our pieces are set up now, ready for demolding. And again, just always good practice when you're working with casting resins like this, that again, these are mass casting resins that cure from the thickest point irradiate out. So the thinnest area will always be the last to cure. So when you can peel up an edge like that, that's usually a good sign that you can go and demold your piece. Also, pulling out what's left over in the mixing cup is always a good way to check your work. And it looks pretty nasty, but you can see it came out clean. That's a good indication that we got everything stirred up properly. Again, one of those finer points to adding fillers to resin systems like this is when you're adding especially a filler like sand or something that can thicken the resin considerably, you can easily create a situation where you don't get a good mix if you're not careful. So again, don't be shy about getting everything stirred up properly. Now this still has substantial weight to it, but not quite as heavy as the previous piece. And you see the fidelity of this cast, it just came out a lot cleaner just because we don't have that really high viscosity to contend with. So definitely something to think about. If you're casting really big chunky parts with, like, say, large life cast pieces with overall fairly smooth surfaces and not a lot of really fine areas like this, like thin edges, then you can go crazy with filler. But if you're doing a lot of really thin sections or pieces like this with a lot of really fine detail, that's where you really have to be careful about using too much filler. Or, and we'll show this maybe in a future tutorial, of doing a layer of straight casting resin first and then backfilling it with a filler. Now here you see I didn't get to that edge, so I got a couple of bubbles there, but overall the face of the part came out pretty nice. That of course is Leech Man in his younger days. And there is our final piece. And again, because we didn't have any moisture reaction with the moisture, you don't see that swelling up. You'll be able to tell by looking at the cross section of a part. If it starts to swell out like a foam, that's a bad sign. That means you've got moisture that's somewhere in there that your resin is reacting to. So be very careful about that, because again, this cleanup is tricky enough as is, but when you start adding fillers to it like sand, it's basically like trying to run your saw through a rock. So be very mindful of that, and be very careful if you're using a resin system like something other than ArtKast pourable. Make sure you test it first and see how it reacts to that filler. Especially, again, dry fillers are a magnet for moisture. So if you're not careful, it can very easily react with the casting resin, cause that to swell, and you'll wind up with a part that is almost impossible to trim back down. So there you have the process of casting a resin part using dry fillers. In this instance, of course, we used play sand, but as discussed, you could just as easily use dry plaster or even UltraCal 30 or anything like that, any dense dry material. Just really important. I can't stress this enough. This is a very moisture resistant system, so it works well with dry fillers. But if you're working with something that's very sensitive to moisture, you could easily have a part react with that and start expanding like foam. So that's where I just want to really impress this on you. Really important, if you're working with dry fillers a lot, make sure you use either a heat lamp or a hot light arrangement with a bucket of your dry filler, and that lamp, like an incandescent bulb, will help heat up that filler and evacuate the moisture out of it. Or even just putting it in a pan and baking it at low temperatures. But real important to make sure you don't have any moisture latent there in your dry filler material. So there you have the use of dry fillers of play sand in ArtKast resin. Again, this is a great way to lower the cost of your casting resins, but more importantly, as I discussed at the beginning of the video, the main reason for doing this is obviously it lowers our cost, but it also gives a sense of value to the part. A lot of resin casts, when they feel really light, feel cheap. So it's kind of a nice arrangement for you as the artist to be able to both lower the price of your cast, but then also give it a more expensive feel by adding that weight to it. So I hope that answers your questions. Those of you who've asked me about that recently, hope this addresses some of that. And if you are new to this sort of casting, or even if you've been doing this for a while, make sure you check in the video description. I'm going to put a link to our video library page. We update that on a regular basis, and I hide some little gems in there of additional wisdom that we don't necessarily have on YouTube. But the most important thing about finding videos in our video library is we organize our videos by topic, so it's much easier to find what you're looking for. And then we have links to all the products we use in the video that you can click on there. So be sure to check that out. I'll put all of the products we used in this demonstration in the video description. And of course, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And thanks again for watching. We're coming up on almost 19 years, but pretty soon it'll be 20 years of molding and casting business here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we couldn't have done it without you all. So thanks again for watching and all of your support over the last almost 19 years.